Good afternoon, everyone. I truly appreciate the opportunity to welcome you to this unprecedented symposium. We've invited residents to come to the table with scientists and city staff to explore what took place at Oakwood Cemetery Chapel in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We will learn how the City of Austin's Parks and Recreation Department responded to meet the requirements of the Texas Historical Commission and the May 2020 report describing this archaeological journey. In addition, you will learn how PARD continues to respectfully reinter and remember the 39 individuals buried and forgotten under the chapel's foundation. Through the latest evidence and advances in bioarchaeology and genetic anthropology, we can learn so much more than we ever could before. We will hear from some of the top scientists in their fields from across the US to discover what we can learn from DNA analysis and bioarchaeology. Most importantly, we are here to remember the individuals found at Oakwood Cemetery Chapel and learn from each other about how a community can respond and come together to commemorate these individuals and take one step forward to heal the wounds of racism.
My name is Gregory Farrer. I'm an exhibit assistant and a part of the team here at the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel. My story began at Oakwood in February of 2019. A part of that was doing genealogy and site research for my family's Austin roots, and I was able to find an online map of the different sections of the cemetery. My great-great-grandfather and my other family members were buried in what was known as the historic colored grounds. One of the things that we try to do is talk about the lesser known truths of the grounds, specifically how this section here was originally part of the segregated section with crossover with the visitors that died while passing through Austin, as well as the poor. I took it upon myself to go a little deeper. Let's go through our database and get their names or individual records so that we can illuminate who is here as best as we can. To not only get the numbers, but to get the names. The names behind the numbers connect us to that sense of humanity. So the end goal was not only to produce that list, but to compare it with a GPS marker survey that took place over the summer of 2019. And that survey basically looked at all of the remaining headstones here in section 4-CG. You would get a much better picture of the scope of who's not accounted for in terms of markers. Over the summer of 2019, staff members Chad Williams and William Delgado conducted a GPS marker survey of section 4-CG. The survey returned roughly 300 markers. The picture begins to become a lot clearer. At least 2,731 recorded burials, a little over 300 surviving markers. Was the system ever documented? Was a map ever produced? Did Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crowism play into this poor record keeping? Many prominent Black families bought lots here in the late 1800s to early 1900s. After which some people believe the grounds were full. When they buried my great-great-grandfather on December 19th, 1916, there is a record that the remains of an infant were found and moved to a different lot. That's after my family bought the lot and buried our first relative here in 1910. The name of the infant and the name of the lot they moved the remains to are not in the database. This is a window into the frustrating work that doing genealogy research as a person of color can be.
So let's start here. This picture is of 2 burials from the Hicks Archaeological Report that is publicly available. And I want you to look at the soil in this picture and how compact it is. This type of soil is difficult to dig in, and it's not conducive to good bone preservation. The report states that when remains were found, they appeared to be in good condition, but then upon further excavation, they became fragmentary. And these fragments were carefully wrapped up and transported to Texas State. So the first step for us then was to open all of these small packages of bone and begin the process to clean an inventory. For this, I would like for you to imagine that someone gave you a 1,000-piece puzzle, and each piece was encased in a dirt matrix, not the easy kind that's not the kind that's loose and easy to brush off, but the kind that you saw in the previous picture. And so imagine you have to clean every piece of this puzzle before putting it together. And you have to be careful cleaning it so that you don't damage the puzzle pieces, so you can fit it back together properly. This is what it was like to clean the remains of each skeleton. Once the data was collected, we could then begin the analysis. And because the cemetery dated to the mid to late 19th to early 20th century, written records were available. And some of the methods that we use in our analysis are population specific, but also time period specific. So we wanted to get an idea specifically of who was buried in this cemetery and who the individuals represent that were excavated. So a few summers ago, we had a McNair scholar from Trinity University, Michelle Wynn, who interned with us, and she downloaded and compiled all of the cemetery records from Oakwood. They had been digitized and were available through the Austin Public Library. And we discovered that section 4, where the chapel was built, was referred to as the stranger's ground, or as it is called, the colored grounds. Here is an example of what these records look like. You can see that there are some individuals with names and some that are unknown. There is a racial category listed for each individual, and this gave us an idea of who was buried within this section of the cemetery, with the overwhelming majority, except a few, recorded as Black, white, or Mexican. So after learning the demographic makeup of the cemetery, I needed to find appropriate reference data to estimate the population affinity or the group membership for each individual burial. So to estimate population affinity, cranial measurements were used from each individual if they were possible to record, and those were statistically compared to appropriate reference groups. So individual measurements from an individual were statistically compared to the groups that you see here on this slide. And individuals that had more metrics had better or stronger estimations. Because of the fragmentary nature, it wasn't possible to get a full set of measurements. So some of the estimations are considered moderate, some of them are considered strong. And for individuals that had poorly preserved crania, we used dental metrics, so measurements from the teeth, and statistically compared these to broad population groups, including European, African, and Asian. So overall, the population estimates that you see here on this slide mirror the diversity in the cemetery records.
The burial seating, that was the key indicator in helping to locate where the graves were, the unmarked graves. And there's a difference in soil texture, as Dr. Spradley pointed out in her presentation. And so being able to identify that is key, and then going from there and excavating. So usually, like in pictures, you see, you know, excavations are fun and you have wide open spaces. Well, now we were doing interior excavations within the chapel itself. So space was really confined, which posed a problem, but it's okay. We can contort ourselves into various positions. And then with this particular project, the chapel was built on existing burials. So some of those burials were bisected by the foundation themselves. So we had to do interior excavations and exterior excavations at the same time. So that was quite a challenge to be able to get a complete skeleton out. because this is a human. You need to be able to do everything as ethically as possible. So that was one of the main challenges, having to we had to tunnel under the foundation to get out the complete skeleton. Yeah, so.
You mentioned the ethics, and so I'd like to open it up to folks and ask, can you address the ethical concerns of excavating at cemeteries?
Well, I'd say, this is Brandon. I think that certainly there's ethical concerns, absolutely. They're sacred areas, essentially. These are the final resting places of men, women, and children. And as such, I don't know anybody that takes it very lightly at all. It's a very serious undertaking. And I think in terms of that, we've addressed these ethical concerns by laws that we have enacted to help protect cemeteries and individual graves, and that there's very specific and narrow procedures in which a cemetery would ever be disturbed. And so, for instance, in Texas, we have the Health and Safety Code, Chapter 711, which specifically deals with burials and the disposition of the dead. And so there's very few circumstances in which they are disturbed. It has to be something pretty extraordinary. And so I think that everyone involved in this takes the ethical concerns very seriously. Everybody has, the public in general has their own cultural and religious concerns and ideas about burials. And so that's how I look at it.
I wasn't really involved with the archaeology so much, but once the remains were transferred to our laboratory, but you have to treat everybody with respect and dignity. And these were all individuals that were somebody's relative. So once they're in the lab, we all treat them, as they were our own relatives, as we would want our own relatives to be treated. And, being kept in a secure access laboratory is important for ethical considerations too. Not putting the remains where they're on display for just even the general student population. They were kept in an area of the lab that was, somewhat secure from other students that weren't involved with the analysis. Following the best practices within the field of biological anthropology and bioarchaeology for data collection and analysis, and conducting public outreach, keeping the public engaged, and then having community engagement for what happens with that data and who can use it, I think is important also. Stepping back
one level would be that finding the 37 men, women, and children under the chapel, where we didn't have any idea what we were going to encounter. I think that was really a shock and surprise to most people involved in the project. Yeah. And I think that in and of itself was stunning, quite honestly. I think that we're dealing with a situation that it was a matter of context and time and history. At that particular time, for whatever reason, it was deemed okay to bury these individuals and then build a structure over them. That's tough. And I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole too far at this point, because I think it's a lot of, there's just a lot of history there that need to be dissected. I could just add a little bit to that. So even present day, I work with marginalized communities. I work with migrants who die at the Texas-Mexico border. I work with a lot of unidentified people that are buried, not following the law. And what I found is that there have been structures placed over those burials. When a cemetery wants to build a new building, they did so on the unidentified section. I think this is, we see this over and over again in history. People that are marginalized are not looked at the same. And,
yeah, no.
This just repeats itself over and over again.
Based on the preliminary archival research that had been provided, there was the thought that, okay, if there are graves here, they may be African-American based on the historic maps of the cemetery. Okay, so that there was a concern there for sure. But I think once we got the analysis results back, I think it was very surprising that we see a very mixed group of individuals. We see men, women, children, African Americans, Hispanics, and white. I think that was a little surprising for folks as well. And I think that it kind of leads itself to, I think that Austin it's been mentioned earlier today, that Austin was diverse and it's diverse today. So I think there's a certain parallel there. that I find interesting.
Archaeologists, I like to think of it that we kind of give history some kind of mass. And I think that that mass is the physical remnants of our history and our heritage. And, you know, cemeteries are a pretty substantial component of culture and life, because it's something that our culture surrounds these sorts of ceremonial events. And I also think that they're a reflection of how we treat those who come before us. And so, you know, one of the things that there's certainly a prevailing theme in a lot of the discussions, and including the Oakwood Cemetery project, where these are public development projects that seem to uncover unmarked graves fairly often. And I want to get the group's take on why that might be.
I think it's very easy historically for cemeteries of minority groups and poor people to get left behind, because entire communities were displaced. They were removed from their homes, whether forcibly, but they were taken away and go to new areas, and their cemeteries are lost and forgotten. So let's take one example, and that's the Great Migration, which is when millions of African Americans in the United States moved in the late 19th and early 20th century. They generally moved from rural areas in the South to urban areas, and then moved to cities in the North. And they were leaving behind their entire lives and the places that they were familiar with, including their cemeteries. And they were really didn't want to leave their homes, but it was a forced migration by the dire circumstances they found themselves in. They were facing racism and lack of economic opportunity in the Jim Crow South. So that Great Migration happened, and just think for a moment, what happened to those cemeteries when they left? There was no one left to protect them. The white people in the area weren't inclined to care for the black cemeteries. And over time, those cemeteries get swallowed up by vegetation, headstones get knocked over and broken, the wooden markers simply deteriorate, and people can come along and look at that land and say, well, we could use that for something productive. And so that's how I think a lot of cemeteries were never intentionally neglected, but they were neglected out of the facts of historical racism and migrations of people, and they do get lost in time and space, and a cemetery can be lost in a single generation, can be totally forgotten, and we've seen examples of that.
The great majority of the early 1800s burial grounds were completely segregated, and so as time went on, the roads that were small little county roads, when they were expanded, the road was expanded in the area of the segregated cemetery. And so that's why a lot of times TxDOT will find many of these, because the highway now, the major highways were once old county roads. One of the best ways to find that any researcher beginning a project can begin to look is in the 1936 county highway maps, because those maps will actually show the segregated areas and give you a clue as to whether or not there might be something there.
So if individuals share large sections of DNA in common, it is indicative of a close biological relationship, and the degree of genetic sharing can help us ascertain what that relationship might have been. So for example, if two individuals buried at Oakwood Cemetery share about 50% of their DNA, that would tell us that we have identified either a parent and child or a pair of siblings. Or if someone alive today thinks that their great-great-grandmother was buried here, and we find that a woman interred in the cemetery shares about 6.25% of their DNA with this person, it would suggest that this very well may have been their great-great-grandmother.
And finally, it may be possible to identify some of these individuals' living descendants. To demonstrate what this might look like in terms of a family tree, I used a standard of 20 years for a new generation to begin. Therefore, given that many of these individuals were born on average around 1860, their 6th or 7th generation descendants would be alive today.
Working with descendant communities in these contexts is critically important because these are the communities that are most invested and interested in these studies, and it's important to have conversations so that the research can be sure to address questions that are of interest to descendant communities and stakeholder communities, and to get the insights from community members about the history. That I know from past experience and in other contexts, we find that community members are often very familiar with relevant history that as a geneticist I may not know, and that can be critically important for us to interpret the genetic data correctly and to come to our best insights.
Bioarchaeology has the potential to add missing pages to a past that historical chroniclers either did not see or did not choose to record. The past of enslaved African Americans, beyond their own precious narratives, is such a past. However, bioarchaeology has long been part of the objectifying white gaze on our past, racializing and naturalizing the Black body rather than seeing it as a reflection of its circumstances, as Frederick Douglass observed it to be. The archaeology written around these bones has only begun in the past 30 years to give more than a thin context to interpret the story they tell. These data are evidence of real change in the physical quality of life associated with changing labor. This is a part of the story that we're not going to find written anywhere else except on the bones of these ancestors. Our approach is always to work for a community that has chosen questions that they think are worthy of holding the remains out of the ground for some period of time for examination. And then, as in New York, to rebury them with dignity and memorial to a known community, better known for what our scientific methods can tell us.
When we say all together here, it is the acknowledgement that the overall space in Section 4 of the cemetery was a combination of burial space originally designated for people of color, those that passed in Austin while visiting, and the poor. Different sections that over time merged with one another due to usage of space. The people buried beneath the footprint of the chapel reflect this in what was determined by the Forensic and Anthropology Center at Texas State University. Our panel today focuses on the cultural, historical, direct and indirect factors happening in Austin, the state of Texas, and in general for the communities of color, the communities of immigrants and visitors, and the communities of low socioeconomic class. With the establishment of Oakwood Cemetery in 1839, the same year of the incorporation of the former city of Waterloo becoming Austin, the capital of the Republic of Texas, we use this as our beginning date for this discussion. The Oakwood Cemetery Chapel, which originally was constructed as a mortuary chapel, opened in 1914. So we will begin looking directly at the time period between 1839 and 1914, roughly 75 years of Austin's early history.
The thing that we need to think about is that flow, that idea which is suggested of frontier, which of course does flag that problematic notion or that problematic process of colonialism. We've also got to understand that thing about frontier means dynamism and change and migration, and these aren't new concepts. And one of your more famous Black Austinites, if I remember correctly, is Jacob Fontaine, of course, and he's brought here, right? So it's like, you know, these flows of people bringing captive men, women, and children to this region to transition the actual demographics of this region, but not necessarily to create equitable lives for these people of African descent. And likewise, for the people of Mexican ancestry and origins, they're living here in a time of political transition and war of conquest to seize this space and kind of take this space captive. And then also to introduce the other complication, which I haven't heard mentioned, is of course the indigenous people who are still here in some way, shape, and form because the Mexicans find them a problem, right? Quote unquote, you know, how do we address this frontier of indigenous people? And likewise, the newfound Texans would find them a problem. So quote unquote problem, not literal, right? So I do think we need to just acknowledge the type of dynamism which is occurring here and the ways in which people are arriving here. Not everyone who arrives here is necessarily arriving here with this grandiose American notion of creating a grand new equitable society. Some are being brought to be the engines which would produce a wealthy or some strain of material production for whites and or others, right?
What is happening about the Mexican social structure is that immediately after the insurgency of 35 and 36 and then the Mexican-American War, the people that had political influence and were members of the landed elite, for the most part, disappeared in the area from East Texas to San Antonio and down to Victoria, Texas. They were either killed or forced out, much like the Native Americans. The Native Americans that survived, for the most part, survived by becoming Mexican, by Mexicanizing. But so the population changes. That upper sector in the Mexican American community disappears for the most part. And so the Mexican community, with the arrival of growing numbers of workers, becomes basically a bottom segment of the working class. So that occurs in the late 19th century. And of course, African Americans are having similar experiences. So they begin to share that bottom position as an ethnic group, and as a bottom segment of the working class. During Reconstruction, they are forced to assume a low position in this new labor system called land renting. So they were free then to become a subject to another kind of slavery that is basically defined by indebtedness. They have to rent the land in order to, by the early 1900s, the majority of people that are tilling the land do not own the land. And the people at the very bottom, the field workers, are Mexicans and African Americans.
The Texas frontier is known to be very lawless. The Texas frontier is very much known to be a site of redemptionist violence and or Southern Democrat violence, right, against African Americans, as well as people of Mexican heritage, right? And you have this tension around that, but you also have these sites of Black community, even building up right around here in Austin. Of course, just want to think about, like, what is it, Wheatsville, Clarkstown, Sprinkle, Garfield, and other Black or free towns or communities, Black communities, which begin to spring up around what we now call, you know, Austin and this surrounding area.
Is this was also, there was in the 1880s a colored convention in downtown Austin where these conventions of former enslaved people were coming together to try to find out how to reform their lives, how to help support one another if they lost somebody. And some of these conventions discussed not just political issues because of their trying to redefine themselves in a space where they were not necessarily welcome, but also to help with community service stuff and social services. So how do they help with debt relief? How do they help when they need to bury someone? So I wonder if that's a space, you know, Greg, when you're for research to look at, you know, what at the conventions, are they talking about burial rights? Because people needed to have support to lay somebody to rest, and they didn't have the money sometimes to afford some of the cemetery fees. So it'd be interesting if there's something there. And the colored conventions movement was a movement that went on from the end of slavery all the way through the mid 20th century.
One of the things that we discover about American burial practices and African American burial practices is that they merge. And the mid to late 1800s would have been exactly one of those periods when we found an amalgamation of practices, some which seemed to reflect more US centered practices, and of course those that extended from our memories of Africa. And so those memories of Africa have been most interesting in my research in cemeteries, the way in which grave markers would not only have the name of the person who died, but earlier in the century, in the 19th century, might even have shells, or specifically cowrie shells, or beach things. And I'm talking about East Coast more particularly, that would remind one of the journey from Africa to the US. As that period shifted and moved more closely to the 1900s, you would find broken pieces of pottery, mattress springs, household items, always not in good condition, but if there was a vase like this one, it might be broken onto the grave, symbolizing the break between life and death. The interest was in not having the spirit that is gone continue to have some vitality in today's world. In other words, being afraid of ghosts and haunts. So marking the graves is the most important, I think, memorial. The grief that was expressed and the funeral practices would have been continued today. The repast, the food after the funeral that the community would bring to the family, very different from Africa, in which the family was expected to provide for the community. But in the US, it shifted, that practice shifted. Taking care that there was time for family from distant parts to get to the funeral. And so the practice of embalming and mortuarial sciences were particularly important for African American families that were scattered. And so the conduct at the funeral where grief was expressed, and sometimes in extravagant ways, were ways to make sure that that outpouring was left there at the grave and that life would continue on. And that resilience that you would find in African American communities is expressed in the practices of the funeral, where the grief was extraordinary, but the recovery and the resilience was also extraordinary.
When I took office as council member for District 1, I set as one of my priorities to focus on historic preservation, both for conservation and for the culture. In order to connect with our past and our future, it is necessary for us to tie the physical history of East Austin to the history of our people and our cultural experiences. The Oakwood Restoration Project is one way that we have been able to tie the two priorities together, recognizing the significance not only of the cemetery itself, but also the sanctity of the sacraments performed here for our ancestors who've passed. And the need for creating spaces, a peaceful place for mourners, is vitally important to our community. One of the most important responsibilities we have as a community, a city, and as a people is to begin to rectify the injustice of nameless, faceless graves at Oakwood. These people have stories. They were loved. They have posterity. To forget they existed is callous and inhumane, and we owe it to them, to current and future selves, to work towards just recognition of their contributions to the building of this capital city called Austin. In times of crisis, in times of joy, we can be supportive of one another by taking our individual and collective experiences and building foundations within our community on which we can grow a solid, connected city for everyone. By embracing the mantra of this event, all together here, we will make Austin the best city it can be for all of us.